Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations, and today I'm going to teach you some stenciling techniques that I used on this adorable little Gloomy Day card. Don't you just love those polka dot muck boots? Before we get started, go ahead and click that subscribe button so that you are notified when new videos are added to my channel. Let's go ahead and get started with this card. Here are a few of the supplies we're going to be using today. I have some white daisy cardstock and pattern paper for my card base. I also have a brick stencil that I cut from my Cricut machine, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and some texture paste and a spatula that we're going to need for the texture paste. We're going to be using the Make a Splash stamp set with thin cuts for the design, and I'm also going to be using a toffee shimmer brush. So let's talk a little bit about the surface I'm going to be working on. This is our Easy Cleanup all-purpose mat. It is brand new out of the box, so I keep having to stick down the sides. You might see me mess with it a little bit today. The brick stencil itself was cut from stencil film using a design in Cricut Design Space, and I'll put the link to that down below. I'm going to be using some post-it tape to place the stencil down onto this all-purpose mat. That will help hold the stencil in place while I'm using the texture paste. I'm also going to be using that post-it tape to mask off the portion of the card where I don't want texture paste. I want the brick to have a toffee color and have a little bit of shimmer to it. So I have a toffee shimmer brush here, and this is brand new, so I'm going to go ahead and shake it to mix it up. And then I'm just going to drip a couple of drops down here onto my all-purpose mat. Once I've added the ink down onto the mat, I'm going to place some of this opaque texture paste next to it and start mixing it together. A little goes a long way with the texture paste, so you don't need a whole lot of it to start out with. Always make sure you put the lid on right away. It does dry out rather quickly. Now I'm not going to mix this completely because I do want some of the white showing through, and I want a little bit of variation in the color of my brick. To apply the texture paste onto the stencil, you're just going to put a small dollop onto your spatula and scrape it across the stencil at about a 30-degree angle. You want to make sure you're not getting under the stencil and you're not lifting the stencil, but you're putting enough down to coat the top of the stencil. You can always remove the excess if you feel like there's too much. It's a bit like drywall mud or royal frosting. You really don't want to overwork it on your project. To add texture to my brick, I am just moving this paste around and adding some ridges. But like I said, you don't want to overwork it. It is a lot like drywall mud. At some point, you just have to walk away. To add a little more variation of color, I am going to splatter some more of that toffee shimmer onto the brick, and then I'm going to take my spatula and just run it across each one of those little splatters. And now I have a brick background. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of that post-it tape, carefully peel away the stencil, and set it aside to dry for about 30 minutes. While your texture paste cures, you're going to want to wash the items you use. This texture paste will cure on those items. It does wash off the all-purpose mat rather well. You don't need to worry about that, but it will ruin your stencil and it will stick to that spatula, making it difficult to use later. Just run them under some soapy water, some warm water, wash them off, let them dry, and you'll be able to use them again later. Now we are going to create those little muck boots or wellies, depending on where you're from. Our family has called them both. And I'm going to be stamping them in intense black ink because I will be coloring them with Spectrum Noir markers. These are our new tri-blend markers where all three colors are included in one marker. This stamp set is called Make a Splash, and it includes thin cuts for these items. It also has some cute little dots and little stripes that you can put right on the boots, and there are those matching thin cuts. We are going to use those a little bit today to cut out these items. I've flipped my Versamat over to the foam side, and I'm going to stamp the image using intense black ink. Our intense black ink is formulated to work with both alcohol markers and watercolor paints. It doesn't smear or smudge when you are using those coloring mediums. I'm going to stamp 3 images today so I can show you how to color in these images using our alcohol markers. I have let this cure for about 5 minutes. We will be adding some polka dots, but I want to color the images first before I add those polka dots. We will be using our Tri-Blend Spectrum Noir markers. These have a light, a mid color, and a dark color all in one marker. You always want to start with the lightest color. And here I'm just going to speed up the video while I shade in these boot images. I have read a variety of opinions on how to color with alcohol markers. Some people use straight lines, other people use brush strokes, some even do circular motions. I found that as long as I'm going back over where I colored to blend that color in, there really is no rhyme or reason to my method of coloring. So I say to you, go ahead and just practice with these markers and figure out a method that works best for you. Another thing I do want to tell you about these markers, the nib inside, so the portion that holds all of the ink, is much shorter than a standard Spectrum Noir marker. You might have to refill those or replace your markers in the future if you do a lot of coloring, or if you are one who uses your alcohol markers for a lot of images, you might just want to consider buying the full-size markers and using the tri-blends for your small projects or for traveling. I prefer the tri-blends over the full-size markers because all three colors are in one marker. I don't have to dig through my stack to try to find the mid, the dark, and the light. Everything's all included in this one marker. Now that the images are shaded with the light, we're going to take the darkest color and we're going to outline and add some shadows. So you go from light and then dark, and then we'll use the mid to do some blending. Again, I'm going to speed up the video as I outline these boot images and add some shading. You are going to have to think about where the light is going to possibly be hitting these boots. If you have any background in art, you know that you always have to picture where the light is possibly hitting an image and where the shadows are going to occur. One of the benefits of these tri-blends is that you don't have to have an art degree to be able to use them. Having all three colors in one marker allows you to create the shading and the blending that you need for your images. Now that we've used the light and the dark on this image, we're going to go ahead and blend the two using that mid color. I'm brushing that mid color between the dark and the light, still leaving a little bit of that light color showing. You will notice that there is quite a difference between the three colors as we start to blend these two darker colors. In a minute here, we are going to add a light color, and we're going to go back and blend all three of those colors together. So now we have blended a dark, a mid, and a light. We've created some shadowing and some reflections on those boot images using all three colors in this red Spectrum Noir marker. Now at this point, I usually try to decide if I want to add some more shadowing. So I might open up that mid-range color like I'm doing here, and I'm just going to blend a little bit more against the dark. I might also grab some of that darker color and add even more shading. I just always like to go back with the lighter color and blend everything all together. If you want to create a more defined shadow, you can grab a brown-gray marker like I have here and brush the color where that dark red color was. Here I'm using that marker to truly define each one of those shadows. It deepens the red color and intensifies the shadow on each one of these boot images. If you're going to want to add more shading to your objects, I would suggest that you use brown gray for warm colors and ice gray for cooler colors. So go ahead and add those to your wish list. To add the dots to these boots, I'm starting out with some pigment ink in White Daisy and some white embossing powder. I realized quickly that this was a mistake. These dots are a bit difficult to line up, especially if you are trying to look over a camera, and that White Daisy ink shows every mistake you could possibly make. So this is where I ended up grabbing my Versamark ink. The Versamark ink is a clear ink that sticks to the embossing powder. Now the nice part about using Versamark ink, if I am off by a little bit on my alignment with this stamp, I can brush off the excess embossing powder like I'm doing here. After heat setting the embossing powder, I use the matching thin cuts to cut out each one of those boot images. I also created a buckle, which is an additional embellishment that comes with this stamp set. Now you can see I did use Post-it tape to hold down these thin cuts. I use my Post-it tape for a lot of things because it doesn't tear my paper when I'm removing it. Now we're going to create the sentiment on the card, and there's a couple to choose from. I chose the one that says sending sunshine on a gloomy day. I'm going to heat emboss this using some clear embossing powder and this candy apple pigment ink. I'm sure you noticed the bundle of flowers that magically appeared on this scene. I did create those off camera with this stamp set, the matching thin cuts, and my Spectrum Noir markers. Now all we have to do is assemble the card. You probably noticed that the paper you see in the background is not the same paper I showed you at the beginning of the video. I realized as I was creating this that gray pattern paper there up in the corner doesn't quite match the design of the card, but the craft paper and that blue skies cardstock matches these boots perfectly, and it's a nice subtle contrast to the brick pattern that I created with the texture paste. To match the rustic feel of the card, I've added some bits of twine from our burlap ribbon. I've showed how to do this in some of my previous videos, and then I'm placing everything down on the card using some 3D foam squares. And now our card's complete. As you can see, I did add a couple of red enamel dots to this card. These were from my stash, but I'm sure you probably have some somewhere. I hope that this project inspired you to try texture paste and create a brick background, and I hope that you learned a little bit more about our Tri-Blend Spectrum Noir markers. New projects are added every week to my blog and YouTube channel. If you enjoyed today's card and wish to see more in the future, make sure to go ahead and click that subscribe button and notification icon so you are notified when I add new videos to my channel. If you wish to see more projects like this one, you can click on the collection icon above. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to see what you create.